study. This week we will be covering the portion that is called Pinchas, or Phineas in English, and we are covering Numbers 25 verses 10 to, it depends on which type of Bible you have. In some of the Bibles, the chapters move one forward or one back, but for the Bible that I'm using, it's to chapter 30 verses 1, and we will spending the predominant or the majority of our time we'll be spending in chapter 25. And then if you look at the half Torah portion for this week, you can also get a few different ones, but the one that I use is Jeremiah, and the Brit Arashah, which is the New Testament portion, is John. So let's get started. So as you see, we are covering quite a lot of chapters, and chapters 25 deals with Pinchas and his spear. And this story started actually in last week's portion, where a plague hit the people because of the sin of the people that started going into idolatry with the Midianite and the Moabite women. Remember, Balak got Bileam to come and curse the people. They couldn't do it. So he said, I have an idea. Send these women in to take them into idolatry and to sexual sin, and then they will bring a curse upon themselves. And we then see that a gentleman and a lady enters into the tabernacle, and there they have sexual relations. And Phineas then jumps up and runs his spear through these two people. And we only get to see if that was the right or the wrong decision in this week's portion. So last week's portion sort of ended on a cliffhanger. And then we see what's the consequences of that this week. And then chapter 26 covers the counting of the men. So all of the men in Israel from 20 upwards are counted. And then we have Zealotry's daughters. And what happens here is he had no sons. And so he wasn't counted amongst the people of Israel in the previous chapter because he had no sons to be counted. And his daughters then went to Moses and asked, should our father now be, erased from Israel? And they made all of these rules for men who don't have sons and their inheritance in Israel. And then we also see in that chapter that God says to Moses that this is now it. You are nearing the end of your life. And Moses is then said to appoint Joshua in his place, and Eleazar becomes the high priest. And Eleazar is actually Phineas's dad, and so Eleazar becomes the high priest, and he then anoints Joshua to take over Moses' role. The next chapter is offers that you bring by fire and how they are to be margined out and done. Chapter 29 covers the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Booths. And in Hebrew, the Feast of Trumpets is Yom Teruah. The Day of Atonement is Yom Kippur. And the Feast of Booths is called Sukkot, as well as the sacrifices that you bring with those feasts. And then chapters 30 is to be continued. It actually spills over to next week. So let's start with chapter 25 of Numbers. And we're starting in verse 10. Adonai said to Moses, Pinchas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the Cohen. So remember, Cohen means high priest. So Aaron is the high priest. He has a son that is Eleazar, and Eleazar's son is Phineas or Pinchas. Okay. Has deflected my anger from the people of Israel by being as zealous as I am, so that I didn't destroy them in my own zeal. And this is actually such a contradictory thing that Phineas did. Right? Violence is not really condoned in the commandments of God. And though accidental violence sometimes do happen, they will later on as you move into Joshua, you'll see that Joshua or Judges, I can't remember, that they place cities of refuge for these people. But what Phineas did, he did without authority. And you never actually know what will happen if you don't ask God what to do. But God is condoning what he did as good. What makes it weird is that it's basically murder. He took a spear and he ran it through these two people. And that breaks one of the 10 commandments, which is you shall not murder. And so this is why it's so contradictory that this was okay. And God is saying, why is this okay? Because there was nothing personal in Phineas that he could gain from this. It was nothing that he did that could bring blessing on him. He didn't know in advance what will happen. But what he did is he acted in in zealousy for God, or zealotry for God. And so what we see is that God didn't have to do it. That this is basically the same as what Moses did when he said, to God, that don't destroy these people, because if you destroy them, your name will be destroyed with the people around them, because they will say their God wasn't able to take them through the wilderness into the promised land. And so as Moses was trying to protect God, Phineas is trying to protect the tabernacle where God's presence resided. And so he was acting in protection of God and the covenant they had with God. And so we see that lest we, this is the next zealotry, is about lest we have any doubts about Pinchas' zeal. These divine words affirm that he acted on behalf of God, right? So they're saying here that in zealotry, he's acting on behalf of God. Like I said previously, there's nothing for him to gain here. And as we know from the Israelites, they are forbidden to worship any other gods, because God said, I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. And that jealousy and zealous is the same thing. Religious zealotry channels the passion of God's possessive and exclusive relationship with Israel. And so we see that God said, I don't want you to have any other gods, to fall into sin where you worship other gods. And by these two people having this act in God's tabernacle, they are basically desecrating the tabernacle of God, first of all. And second of all, the plague that came upon them was because of idolatry. And so we see that is what Phineas is acting upon. And that is why, even though it's contradictory, it is the correct thing to do. And so in Numbers 25, that should say 12 to 13, therefore say, I'm giving him my covenant of shalom, covenant of peace, making a covenant with him and his descendants after him, that the office of Cohen, the high priest, will be theirs forever. So this is how Eleazar became the high priest. It's not actually his actions, it's the actions of his son gave the priesthood to Eleazar, not Itamar, who is the other son of Aaron. This is because he was zealous on behalf of his God and made atonement for the people of Israel. So we see here God repeats again that he was zealous on behalf of God. He wasn't zealous in himself. So let's look at this word shalom. Shalom is a word we find often in Hebrew. It's used as a greeting. Shalom can be goodbye, and that's peace to you, or welfare to you, prosperity to you. It's like saying have a good day, or goodbye. It means to be good, and as you go, it's good, it's well, it goes well with you. Shalom is also something that we add onto the word for Shabbat. We often say Shabbat Shalom, which means have a blessed day of peace, right? And so we see that this word encompasses everything that is good. It means to be safe, welfare, health, prosperity, favor. It can be greeting, goodbye, good, health, prosper, welfare. And so we see it's a very positive word. And one of the phrases that is used here is perfect. And it's also seen in a word of well-being with you. And so when you look in this specific chapter, it's very interesting. The word shalom is always spelled in this way that it is, as you see it on the screen. Now remember that in Hebrew, we read from right to left. This letter that you see that is circled in red, that letter is called VAV. And so this is what a VAV is supposed to look like. And whenever you spell shalom, this is how you will spell it. But remember, Yeshua said that not one jot or tittle will disappear from his word. And that means that as it was written down in the original text, that is exactly how it is copied. And a kosher Torah scroll will not be kosher unless every single thing is perfectly copied from the original text. And so if someone makes a mistake, if the letters touch, if the letters are broken down, it's no longer considered as kosher. But what we do see, if you look at the original Hebrew text, that sometimes some letters are oversized, sometimes they are small, sometimes they are broken up. And this is done with the deliberate effect. It was supposed to be that way. And those that we will consider mistakes or irregularities are also copied perfectly. So even the mistakes that we would think is mistakes, oversizing something or putting something smaller that we think, oh, this was a mistake. No, that was divine purpose from God. And in this week's portion, I just want to go back again when it says, therefore, I am giving him my covenant of shalom. We see that the word shalom and the VAV specifically doesn't occur in its normal form. So this is what it looks like in a kosher Torah scroll. We can see that the VAV, the picture below is what the VAV is supposed to look like. But in this Torah scroll, we see that the VAV is broken down. And we're going to have a look at what does that mean when this VAV is broken down in such a manner. So first of all, the letter VAV means a man of the word. Now the VAV means hook, and it's used as the word and. Okay, so that's how it's used. Hooking sentences and concepts together, you and me, today and tomorrow, they will use that word VAV. The numerical value of VAV is 6, and we know that man was created on the 6th day. And so the numerical value of the word means man, and the picture of it means to hook. Now, mankind is God's ultimate and. It's his ultimate VAV. It's his ultimate hook. Because we are spirit and we are flesh. So those two things are hooked together within us as human beings. And so when God, who is spirit, became flesh, Messiah, he too became an and. In Messiah Yeshua alone are the spiritual and physical dimensions hooked together in an eternal bond. So let's just unpack this quickly. So in Messiah alone, that is spiritual, what he does is he hooks this divine being that is God, that is spiritual, into a physical dimension so that we can have understanding, a deeper intimacy, a deeper understanding of this spiritual Father that we have. And he hooks it together in an eternal bond. And that bond is called the covenant. And this was by Grant Luton, and previously we've used his book in his own words as a reference, and this comes from that book of his. So let's look again. In this VAV used in Shalom, now remember it's the broken VAV. That broken VAV means that it is a broken man. Who is this broken man? If you said Yeshua, you are right. And so it is through Messiah's brokenness on the cross that we are hooked back together to God. We are grafted into Israel. We are hooked back into covenant and intimacy with him. And we know that there are no physical temples now. But God hooked us as a temple to his presence. He said, you are the living tabernacle of God, and therefore I'm hooking you to my presence. Like I was found in the temple in the wilderness, I'm hooking my presence to your physical bodies. And he's done that through Messiah's brokenness. And so as this VAV was broken, so was Messiah also, and it was to hook us in an eternal bond of covenant. And so let's look again at this shalom word that is used in this week's portion, the covenant of shalom. So again, remember, we read from right to left. That's what the VAV is supposed to look like. If you look at this top part of the VAV that is now basically broken in half, I don't know if you can see, but that actually looks like another Hebrew letter. And that Hebrew letter is called the letter Yod. And I hope you can see, and that my video is not covering this section, but Yod means man's soul. The reason for that is that the Yod is written on the top half. It doesn't touch if you write on a paper, it doesn't touch the line, it hangs in the air. And that's sort of a representation of our soul, which is what we are. Remember, God said that he breathed into us the neshama of life, and we became a living soul. And so we see this upper part, the VAV, which represents our souls in our bodies. We have a second part, and that's what the yod looks like. We have the second part to the VAV that is broken, which is a line. And what this is, this line means, this is the line that connects the soul to the earth. And what is the one thing that connects our souls to the earth? It's our bodies. As soon as our souls depart from this world, this realm, this dimension, our bodies die. Our bodies and our soul are the things that connect us to this earth. And so this line is a representation of us being connected to earth. So what I want to do is I want to read a few parts of this book from Grant, and the edition that I have is the first edition. I hope you can see. It looks like this. He has a new edition out, and it has a very colorful new pretty cover. But I am reading from page 71, and it's to the lower half of the page. The second last sentence I'm starting. According to Isaiah, our peace with God was purchased by means of Messiah being broken. The punishment that brought us peace, Shalom, was upon him. This is in Isaiah 53, verses 5. Instead of running his spear of judgment through his sinning creatures, God allowed his son, Yeshua, to take our punishment upon himself. And so we see that these people that Pinchas drove a spear through, it was because of their sin. And what Messiah did for us, let's read that again. Instead of running his spear of judgment through his sinning creatures, us, God allowed his son, Yeshua, to take our punishment upon himself. Isn't that amazing? So instead of us taking that punishment on our bodies, disconnecting us from this earth and disconnecting our body from our soul, what Yeshua did is he brought us back together again. Later on, he also speaks of this broken VAV, and he says, but the difference between the average man of the world and the man who is at peace with God is that the spiritual man has been broken. His soul finds its identity not in the flesh, but in the spirit. Only by becoming a broken VAV do we come into God's covenant of peace and experience the shalom of God. And only through brokenness do we change from Jacob, and we'll get to that later, just remember Jacob, to an Israel. Let us not hinder God's loving hand as he would bring us into peace by a way of brokenness. May he make us like Pinchas, who was zealous for God and saved many from death, and not like the lustful man whose physical passion brought death and shame to both himself and his people. And this is just an amazing picture, right? Is that we see that in this thing that we as humans are trying to avoid, which is brokenness, that's actually where God brought his biggest redemption and healing for us through Yeshua being broken. And I must think that what Pinchas did must have tore his soul apart. Taking a life it tears your soul apart. And so this VAV is also a representation of him being torn apart. It's not something he wanted to do, but it's something that was necessary. And so what is it about being broken? We see this often, and we're going to look at a few examples, but an important example to look at is Jacob and his hip socket. Now remember, Jacob fled to his uncle Laban's house. He got his wives and his kids, and then was no longer good for them to live with Laban. So they decided they're going to come back. And on their way back, Jacob heard that Esau, your brother, that you actually ran away from to Laban, he's coming, and he's coming with 300 men or 400 men, I can't remember. And so he was so scared, he divided his family into two camps, and he said, if Esau attacks the one half of the family, at least the other half will survive. And he camped the night before he then set out to meet Esau. And in his tent, he thought Esau was attacking him. And so he was strifing with Esau in his mind the whole night. And as the sun came up, he realized this is not Esau, this is a messenger of God. And he said, and God himself, and he said, what is your name? And he said, if you don't know my name, that whole thing. And then he said, don't leave me without blessing me. And God dislocated his hip socket. And from there on, he had a bit of a limp. And he said to him, you will no longer be called Jacob, but you will be called Israel. And let's go back to what we just read. We read that Jacob means supplanter, but Israel means prince of God. And so by him being broken, and if you look at the bones of a hip socket, it looks like a VAV. But by him being broken, we got the name of Israel, which means prince of God. And so we see that it was only once Jacob was completely broken to such an extent that he could no longer be called Jacob, that his blessing came, that the blessing of Israel came. And it's through this name that we are all blessed. It's into this tree that Messiah Yeshua grafted us in. And so we see there's a profound thing when we allow God to break us. The next example is the alabaster box that we find in Mark 14, verses 3. As he reclined at table, a woman came having an alabaster flask of ointment, of very costly pure nard. This is oil, right? And she broke the alabaster flask and poured it over his head. And these alabaster boxes were very expensive. And the oil inside was very expensive. But the only way to get the oil out was to break the vessel, break the box. And all of us have a potential. All of us have pure oil inside of us. But the only way to really allow it to flow into the kingdom, to minister to other people, to bless other people, is for that vessel that we are trying so hard to protect to be broken. Another example, of course, is the wine press. That grapes are lovely, but as grapes are cheap, and then if you buy grape juice, it's even more expensive, and wine, it's even more expensive because it's going through processes. And the taste improves often over these processes. But in order to get the wine, you have to crush the grape. It's totally and completely crushed until there's just pulp left. And there's no ability left to distinguish between one grape and another. And that's what brings out the juice that then becomes the wine. And remember that wine is used on the Sabbath. Wine is used in the tabernacle, on the table of showbread. We also see another place of the table of incense. The incense are spices. Now, if you are from any form of Asian descent, you know what it takes to get the flavor out of a spice. The only way to get the flavor out of a spice is to, unfortunately, crush it, first of all, and second of all, to then apply heat. But that brings out the most aromatic food you'll ever get. And this is what the temple smelled like on the inside. It had this amazing flavor of the incense that was crushed and burned. And then, of course, olive oil. We are grafted into this tree, to an olive tree. I don't know if you've ever had an olive tree. I remember I once tasted a raw olive. You've never tasted such a horrible thing in your life. It's so bitter. But yet, if you press it and press it and press it, and you get the oil out, that oil was used in the menorah. And that oil is used in cooking, and it's the most amazing, luxurious, silky smooth, golden liquid. But the only way to get it there is to crush the olives over and over and over again. And so, what is it about brokenness that is so profound? Why does God want us to be broken? Why does God want us to allow him to break us? I just quickly want to take a sip here. And I was actually talking about it to a friend today, and the funny thing is I had no idea that I was going to go on this route of teaching before we had the conversation. And I also didn't know during or after. But we spoke about brokenness and saying that no person escapes being broken in this life. It's something or the other for all of us, where we are utterly crushed, where we feel that we've lost our sense of identity, lost who we are, lost what is important to us, lost the one thing we never wanted to lose, gone through the most horrible pain and experiences in our own lives. And yet often you will hear from that crushing and that horrible experience, people harness something from it that not only benefits themselves, but also benefits other people. And this is the beauty of being crushed. The moment your vessel is still intact, first of all, you'll have very little in common with other people and very little grace and mercy for others' brokenness. And because you are still whole. The other thing is, if you are whole, why would you even need God? There will never be a need for God in your life. The purpose of God and serving God is to, first of all, better ourselves, but to have intimacy with Him. If there's no brokenness, there's no reason for you to open up the lid and allow God's presence in. It's through these cracks and these wounds that God puts us back together. So we see in Matthew 11 verses 28 that come to me, all of you who are struggling and burdened, and I will give you rest. This is what God wants to give to us. God wants to provide for us, but He can only provide for something that is in need. And then in 2 Corinthians 4 verses 8 to 10, we have all kinds of troubles, but we are not crushed. We are perplexed, yet not in despair. Persecuted, yet not abandoned. Knocked down, yet not destroyed. We always carry in our bodies the dying of Yeshua, so that the life of Yeshua may be manifested in our bodies too. And so we are going through troubles. We are perplexed. We are in despair. We are persecuted. We are abandoned. We feel knocked down and destroyed by often things that we don't see coming, or people that we love very much, or just by life in general. But these are the same things that Yeshua had to endure. And what an honor for us to do it like Messiah did it, to embrace it, the brokenness and the sacrifice like Messiah did, so that it is manifested in our bodies and can be a testimony to other people. And Psalm 71 verses 20 says, though you have made me see troubles, many and bitter, you will restore my life again. From the depths of the earth, you will again bring me up. And so I found a few quotes from the Hebrew College. It's an online site, and they say, the Midrash goes on to explain that as human beings, we are ashamed and embarrassed to use a vessel that is broken. I think if you have guests over, you don't give them the chipped plate or the chipped mug. You keep that for yourself. You give them the whole stuff. We don't give the chipped stuff to people because it makes us feel insecure. It makes us feel stupid. It makes us feel as if we want to give them the best. But not so with God. All God's vessels are broken, all of us. And so we see that and this whole piece was on how the sacrifices had to be perfect. But humans were never meant to be sacrificed. Our efforts and our zeal to pray and bring glory to God and do what He commands us, that is our sacrifice. But us physically, we were never supposed to be the sacrifice. We are the temple. And so we see that we are allowed to be broken, to be part of His kingdom. We are allowed to be broken vessels. And it's only when we embrace our brokenness, embrace our wounds, embrace our scars, and not run away from them, not hide them, not be ashamed of them, that we truly move into our calling. And we'll now see what that calling is. Another thing that I got from them is only in the end of days will that peace be whole. Now that peace, the VAV that is broken, how does it become whole again? And Ezekiel says, I will make a covenant of peace, of friendship with them, and it shall be an everlasting covenant with them. I will establish them and multiply them, and I will place my sanctuary among them forever. My presence shall rest over them. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And so we see here again that covenant of peace. But here the peace is whole. And God says, I'll make an everlasting covenant with you. And so we see when Messiah returns the second time, this will all be made whole again. And even though with his first coming, he took that brokenness away from us as a people and he became broken. But we will all together in him become whole. And the sanctuary will be amongst us forever. God's presence will rest over us forever. And so a man has been broken into. Okay, and that man is Messiah for the sake of a covenant of peace with God and to bring atonement to all Israel. This is the purpose of our lives. Through Yeshua, who has been broken, we get to join in that covenant of peace and be given a priesthood. Because that's what happened to Phineas, right? Phineas got the priesthood for his family through that brokenness, but getting a covenant of peace, making it whole again. And so this is the gospel of the good news, is resurrection. In our brokenness, God puts us back together. He resurrects our brokenness from the death that we experience of being broken, of dying to ourselves, dying to our needs, dying to the thing that we don't want God to take. Right? It's in that death that God says, allow yourself to be broken. I will resurrect it. I will give it back to you. And it will be better than it was before. And so, but there is no resurrection without a death. There is no putting back together without brokenness. And all of this is based on your dependence on God. And are you faithful that He is always there, that every single bad thing in your life has a purpose of purifying you and bringing you to a place of resurrection in your life. And so it's only when we are broken that we can admit that God is sovereign. Because as I said earlier, if you are so perfect, why will you need God? There's no need for Him in your life, but it's in your brokenness and realization that you cannot be placed back together again. You cannot do this or survive this brokenness by yourself that you realize how amazing God's hand is in your life. It is only when we are broken that His light shines through us. And so this is a little tale that the rabbis tell. When he was a young and idealistic, he wanted to change the whole world. When he got a little older and wiser, he realized that he could not do that. So he focused his goal and aimed at changing his country. Later, he again restricted his focus and narrowed it to changing his city. When he could not do that, he tried to change his family. Finally, he decided to improve himself. By doing so, he managed to have an influence on his family, on his community, his city, and beyond. And so, if you allow yourself to be broken and ask yourself, why have this shattered in this way? And how can I be more like Messiah, more like God? And through that searching of self and looking for God, you are placed back together again. And from that brokenness, you can reach and influence other people. And so we are all broken in our journey to find Messiah within. The question is, what will come out of your brokenness? Good wine, olive oil, and incense that is good enough to be used in the temple. And only you can decide to work on yourself and allow God to break you for the good. And so let's look back on what we talked about today. Are you zealous for God, or are you zealous for your ego? Do you take offense on behalf of God or on behalf of yourself? And in that offense for God, is there any ego for yourself? I hope I'll look good. I hope others will see me do this. I hope I get the praise and the glory, because then it's not zealously for God. What can you learn from being broken? Where do you find your identity? If your identity is in things, God will break those things, because our identity should be in Him. The covenant of peace is a covenant of being broken. And the gospel of the good news is the good news of resurrection after that brokenness. Has something good come out of your brokenness in the past? Reflect on that, because often the answer is yes. And so maybe it will allow us to have faithfulness in God in our brokenness in the future, to not ask why, to not be angry at God, to not feel poor or shame me, but to realize that something better will come out of this. And I'm always just reminded of birth pains and the pain that a woman goes through, the brokenness that her body experiences during giving birth and after giving birth. But the result of that pain is new life. And that is beautiful. And that's the same thing that God has for us in our brokenness. I hope that this has meant something to you and that you will not despise being broken, but that you will accept and embrace it and realize that it is only through that brokenness and in that brokenness that the most amazing wine and oil and fragrance can come through and serve in God's kingdom. I hope you have a lovely Shabbat. Shabbat Shalom.
Welcome to this week's Bible study portion, and this week's portion is called Chukat, and it means statutes. Now we're going to look at this passage from Numbers 19 verse 1 to 22 verse 1. So I think if you've been following for the last few weeks, you'll notice that there's a set portion that we study every week, but we don't necessarily cover everything that's in that portion just because of time constraints. So what Natanya and myself